Well, let's go ahead and do some quick introductions then.
Yeah, so
Kathy?
I'm Kathy Carey. I'm a volunteer with the Greater Illinois Area Team. I live right outside of Chicago. I have been a volunteer with AFS for about 15 years, and my primary role has always been support coordinator, and I am an certified intercultural learning trainer, and I've done a lot with presenting ICL training.
And my name's Jean Herder. I'm an AFS volunteer outside of Boston, Massachusetts. It's a pleasure to see you all today. Some faces and names are familiar from various different webinars that we've done with AFS. So hi, friends, and looking forward to meeting new friends. This is going to be a really exciting opportunity to go on our own exchange through the ICL Foundations course. My own self, I was an AFS exchange student in 1986 to Denmark. And then most recently, our family hosted a YES scholarship student from Indonesia last year. And then prior to that, a YES student from Pakistan. And I've been volunteering off and on with AFS since the early 90s. And I know a lot of you have a broad range of experience as well. But I thought we thought it would be a fun thing to do, to pop in the chat if you'd like to go ahead and put your favorite travel destination, where you'd like to go next. So either your favorite travel destination or where would you like to go on your next vacation? Italy. It's very hot in Italy last summer. New Zealand, Faroe
Oh,
Islands.
the Faroe Islands. Very cool. Where did you go in Africa, Valerie?
Zimbabwe.
Ah, very nice.
Yeah.
I think my trip to Tanzania was probably one of my favorite trips I've ever taken to.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. And I saw somebody else just put South Africa on there too.
Yeah. And has anyone else been to Vietnam? No, but Jill wants to go, huh?
Yeah. Yep.
My daughter and her husband went. They loved it. They said that was their favorite destination in Southeast Asia.
Oh, awesome.
I have been to 53 countries, but I have not been to Vietnam. It's on my list.
Yeah.
Wow. In the
Dean
Netherlands.
and I can go together to New Zealand.
That sounds great.
Wonderful.
And the wonderful thing is about having students is that we get to travel without actually having to travel. Or when we do travel, you can always maybe look up an AFS person in that country where you're going. And sure enough, you'll find an immediate community, which is really amazing.
Yeah, it's that worldwide.
Favorite Germany, next up Japan.
Very nice.
Has anyone else been to Japan?
I have been to Japan twice. I've climbed Mount Fuji.
Wonderful.
That's impressive. That's
It
impressive.
took my son a long time to realize I don't climb at the same rate.
Well, I think it's safe to say that we're a crowd of people that love to travel, love to find new things and meet new people, eat new foods, and share a lot of stories. So we're looking forward to sharing those moments with you over the course of the webinar today and also in person in Texas.
Yeah, and so before we can really start sharing, we need to take a second and look at some of our agreements as a community. That we're going to participate actively, which means, of course, we don't have other things open. We're not checking email and doing, avoiding distractions. Same with staying present, trying to stay focused at this time of day. And on a beautiful day, it's difficult. And especially if you've got a football game. Today, the Bears are not playing. So for me, it's a little easier today, but it does, distract us sometimes. Specifically, we really want you to ask questions. There's nothing, I've been a facilitator for years, and as a teacher, there's nothing worse than just being the only one talking. Make sure you ask questions and share your ideas, because that's why we're here. We want to work together to increase our learning, right? Big one, suspend judgment. Be open-minded, respect our diversity, and take risks. Be brave. We're going to be a family for 8 hours in Dallas and for 2 hours tonight. And we really want to hear your voice. We want to make sure you feel comfortable sharing. And does anybody have any other things they'd like to add to this list? Okay. Also, because this is, also because this is online, we're going to kind of do a parking lot. If you have a question, well, we're in the middle of something and you don't want to interrupt and you want to ask it, just put it in the chat and we'll be monitoring it, and we can answer that during the break or after the workshop. All right.
All right, so here we are all in a webinar and a course called Foundations. And so I guess we could start off by talking about what Foundations is. And it's a course that was developed by AFS International at large, and AFS-USA is conducting this class as well. And volunteers from around the world participate in the Foundations class. And it is to increase the basic awareness of intercultural learning and gives volunteers, staff, and frankly, students and host family a shared vocabulary. And it increases our own self-awareness as cultural beings as well, and our own strengths and limitations. I'm sure many of us have experienced, I'll speak for myself, we learn about a lot about ourselves when we work with students and families from around the world. And it can be a very humbling experience and a very empowering experience as well. And Foundations really takes a look at a lot of these experiences, which you all have, and gives it some structure and some frameworks to help us kind of put all these pieces together. And ultimately, it helps us become more active global citizens, which is really the ultimate goal of AFS. And so the version you're participating in is this first section, which is the webinar, and then the in-person section that we'll be doing in Texas. And so you're fortunate that we'll be able to actually meet in person. So for your other colleagues in your teams, if they're interested in a Foundations class, there is an online option through AFS International where they do a lot of self-guided work, and then they get together online with volunteers from around the world. So they get to go on their own little exchange. So there's different ways that Foundations, this particular class, is presented to volunteers around the world. So here we
For
are.
sure.
Welcome on board.
And before the pandemic, we did a lot of traveling and doing in-persons, and then we kind of had to take a little hiatus. And I think that AFS is starting to do that again, starting to get back into some in-persons, because there is such benefit for in-person learning, yeah, and getting together in the same space. Just that synergy that happens that you don't always get when you're on your own. We sent out a questionnaire in the beginning, and we asked you to rate yourself on ICL, and a number of you said you were 3, some said 4, some said 5. And that's great, because when, as a teacher for 30 years, we have this thing called the rule of 3. And basically the way it works is the first time you're exposed to something, it really is just to recognize it and to begin to learn that vocabulary. The second time is to really get a deeper, more in-depth understanding. And then the third time is to really improve your mastery. And that is revisited multiple times after that. As any skill, it's easy to learn. It's always not as easy to apply, especially when you're in the situation where you need it, right? My daughter has borderline personality disorder, and I can't tell you, I mean, we know the behavioral therapy left and right, the dialectic behavior therapy, but when she's in that moment, it's hard for all of us to take that step back and apply those skills we need. And it can be the same with ICL, right? We can learn the techniques, and when we're in those moments and our core values feel challenged and our automatic response just takes over, it's the extra practice and the going over things again and again that really help us to be global citizens and competent interculturalists. I don't think we assigned. Oh, I was going to do it. It's like I skipped to the next slide. Here's our training agenda today. We're right on schedule with our welcome and introduction. We're going to move on now to how AFS creates impact. We're going to then go into some understanding culture, take a break, come back and try to make some of those connections, those real world connections between what we're learning and our lives. And we're going to end with looking at stereotypes and generalizations. And then we're going to reflect on everything and talk about what our next steps are.
So first up is, how does AFS actually create impact? We're known as a high school exchange organization, and many of us might be familiar with the history that goes back to the 1940s, where it was founded by, AFS was founded by volunteer ambulance drivers. But how do we actually create the impact today in 2024 and in the future? And what we're going to be looking at today is, AFS is far more than just a high school exchange program. We have programs for our host families, educational initiatives like this one today, volunteerism and advocacy. And we are empowering people from all over the world with all different types of backgrounds with very specific global competencies, with skills to actually make a difference. And so AFS's mission has really expanded now into creating active global citizens committed to making the world a better place, not just having a really great time overseas someplace. We all know that there's a larger purpose and meaning behind this. So let's move on over to a fun fact. You guys would take a second in the chat. How many students do you think have participated in AFS study abroad programs since 1947? Just off the top of your head, just a number. What do we have here? Oh, no one's taking a guess. Oh, wow, 100,000, 24,000. What else do we have in there? 25,000, 50,000, 25,000, 18,000. You guys are way under. Go higher.
Much higher.
Much higher, yeah. 85,000, higher. 75, higher.
Higher, Precious. Oh,
97,000, higher. I feel like this is like
closer.
The Price is Right or something.
Higher, higher.
A million. Okay, less than a million. 125, 125. Oh my gosh, this is hilarious. Dee, you are like putting in those numbers. Love it. All right. Oh, where we go? Bing, bing, bing. Mitch, we got it. Mitch got it. 500,000. All right. That is an incredible number of not only students, but think about that, families who've hosted, one of the participants, friends that each of those students have made, and the schools and the communities that have experienced an exchange student. And that's just a huge amount of impact and a lot of fun too. You guys did great on those numbers. That was pretty fun. So the specific model that AFS uses to explain their theory of change is that it's not just experiencing difference, experiencing cultural exchanges. It's really about empowering the students, the host families, the volunteers, and everyone surrounding this experience with very specific intercultural skills. And as Kathy was saying, it's not about just experiencing and learning. It's about mastery. It's about practicing these things when you're at your wit's end, when you're exhausted, you have someone in your home and you're full of care, you're full of love, you understand all these frameworks, but you're also exhausted. And sometimes we're not always as our best. And so practicing these skills in real life is really when we become active global citizens, and we're able to help others do that as well. And we can move on to the next slide, which expands this concept quite a bit. AFS has put a lot of thought to very specific experiences, obviously with the high school exchange program, but the learning program is based on a lot of educational research. And so the programs that we are implementing as volunteers through our orientations or even this training itself, it's founded in well-researched theories of education and change and learning. And so AFS's educational goals are, personal, interpersonal, intercultural, and global for sure under the skill set. And then you've probably come across these AFS superpowers, maybe at some point in your AFS career here. So has anyone come across AFS superpowers? Yes, yes, I've got a nod over here. Does anyone want to unmute and share what some of those might be? Or you can put them in the chat too, if you'd like to. It's funny, I'm asking this question. Oh, Michelle, you've just unmuted. Would you like, Michelle G?
I was already unmuted.
Oh, okay.
I could guess, but I'm not sure I'd be correct.
Sean or Shan, but we can't hear you. I see you're unmuted, but we can't hear you for some reason. Or I can.
All right, Kathy's getting us kicked off here with critical thinking. All right, anybody
Shan, I
else?
think your microphone may not be set for the meeting. Like maybe you have to go back and enable audio. And maybe you can do it by clicking down at the bottom on the audio button, go to select your microphone. See, yeah.
No. Sean, we'd love to hear what you have to say. You can put it in the chat too, if you'd like. Oh. Okay.
To do the audio, all you do is you take the audio button on the left of your screen on the bottom, you take it from a red line to open. That's it.
All right, Shan's got adaptability. There's more than one way to
It's true. Adaptability, critical thinking.
right. And then we have oh, Nicola, there we go. You got him. I'll go ahead and read these out. So
Flexibility.
the superpowers,
Flexibility for sure.
AFS superpowers are adaptability, critical thinking, self-awareness, empathy, communication, valuing differences, open-mindedness, global awareness, and change-making. Okay, what does all of that mean? It means that it's an amazing experience to be a volunteer at AFS or a student or a host family or a host sibling, because all of these various skills that you will learn really just make you a superhuman superhero because of your superpowers. And this is a term that we use with a lot of the orientations of the students. And it's kind of funny because the students are like, oh God, superpowers. But when we're having a difficult situation or even a wonderful situation, and we reflect with them about their experience, that's when these superpowers come to be. So the AFS theory of change has the experience, learning, practicing to become a global citizen. Let's go ahead and move on here.
All right.
And
so we're going to move on then to, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we're going to move on to put in the chat. What are some of the experiences, learnings, and practices that you've had that have helped make global change?
And remember, no job is too small. So whether, let's say, a big one in our area in Mass Bay is driving students, because our area goes from Maine to Rhode Island. So we absolutely need people to drive students. It seems like a small job, but it's not. All right. Anyone in the chat?
Not yet.
No? Well, suffice it to say, no job is too small. Everything that you do helps create active global citizens. Hosted a student, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Helping them out when it's not convenient. Valerie, yeah. Orientations.
Participating in orientations, leading.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and hosting presentations.
Nice.
Oh, great.
Neighbors.
Yep, and volunteering with an organization that supports a mission you believe in. I think we're all very motivated. Because
I want to say real quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Precious, you're a liaison. That is a huge experience. And you're participating in intercultural learning, which is a great learning. So you're going to
just feel that I'm just getting in though, so I don't know.
Yeah. And you're going to get a lot of practice this year as a liaison. So you are well on your way, my friend.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, in a nutshell, that is a lot of impact. All of the little things and all of the big things that each and every one of you are doing are really creating an incredible amount of impact. And it's not just hosting an exchange student. There's so much more that goes with that. And we want to thank you also for all that you're doing with AFS, not just to make wonderful experiences for students, but to make it a positive experience for host families and volunteers like yourselves. Really appreciate it.
All right, so now we're going to switch and start talking about culture. And most of you are, well, most of you, some of you are probably groaning like, oh no, here we go again. We're going to talk about culture. But part of intercultural learning, of course, is culture. So we need to make sure that we are all on the same page when we're starting off. So what I'd like you to do is in the brainstorm, we're going to brainstorm together. And in the chat, can you go ahead and put down what you think, what words come to mind when you think of culture? Or a definition of culture.
Belief systems, traditions.
Food, values. Music. Language, for sure. Personal interactions and customs. Shared behaviors, definitely. And Amelia, you hit it right on the head, the values and beliefs that are shared by people, for sure. So the definition we are going to use for culture is a learned and shared pattern of belief, behaviors, and values of groups of people that are interacting together. So we're going to look at, when we talk about culture, we're looking at beliefs, not just the behaviors, but we're going to be looking at beliefs and those core values of the people that we're going to be working with. So here's a quick quiz for you. A lot of times we start off with culture. It's a big nebulous idea, and we try to make it a little bit more usable by using a metaphor or a model to make it have more sense in our brains. So through AFS, we look at multiple models or metaphors to represent culture. And I just wondered if you guys have looked at any, and if you have seen any of those cultural metaphors, what were they?
Iceberg, iceberg.
A lot of people know the iceberg. Has anyone ever seen The Onion? Martha will show you The Onion, where you can see the values on the inside, the rituals, the heroes and the symbols, and it's done with the layers. Has anyone ever seen the Onion model? No? Okay. What about the tree model? Oh, good, Precious. Has anyone seen the tree model? Where the roots go deep under the surface and are as extensive or more than the top of the tree? No? I like the tree model as well. And finally, the iceberg. Yeah. Yes, they are all similar in that they show the layers and the parts that are visible and the parts that are harder to get to, definitely. So is there anybody, we're going to switch screens in just a second, and we're going to have up there a model of the iceberg. Why don't you unmute yourself? And then is there anybody who would like to explain what they, like, I'm going to put you in the position to be the facilitator. Anybody want to volunteer to explain the iceberg model to those who may not be as familiar?
All right, I will try again. Can y'all hear me now?
Yes. Great.
Okay, I had to change devices. Okay.
Perfect.
So the iceberg model is what you see on the surface is what's above the water. So those are the things that are more easily recognizable. But that with an iceberg, there's only 10% that we do see. So there's so much more underneath that the more invisible, the things you just don't notice or see when you're looking at a person. And it's those bigger things underneath that is where we sometimes have the conflicts.
And I like the iceberg myself. I mean, I think it's It's used a lot, so sometimes you look at the iceberg and go, oh, because you've seen it, right? But it's a really good model, and I like exactly what she said, that only 10% is really visible, and those underlying parts that are not so easily visible are some of the ones that are there. And I always like the iceberg model because it makes me think of the Titanic. And it makes me think, when you've got your eye only on the part that's visible, that you are about to get scraped down the side of those invisible parts and you're going to sink. And that's what I like best about the iceberg culture model, because it just reminds me that there's so much more, that when you think you've got a handle on the top part, that's when you're in the most danger of some cultural faux pas and miscommunication. So I wanted to also point out, the thing about the iceberg is we see those behaviors and we can see those values, but we see them from our own cultural lens. We don't necessarily see them as accurate in the same way that the people who are in that culture see them. And I had an example for you where I was comparing the two cultures of the United States and Indonesia. And when we look at those, this one particular aspect that I chose for you is the concept of time. So in the concept of time, it's definitely a hidden thing. You don't see it a lot. But in the United States, what you might see is that we look at the clock, and that we tend to get a little impatient with long delays, right? Don't like to wait in a long line. We get impatient when we're put on hold for a long time. So we're a little bit more looking at the clock and becoming a little impatient when we have unnecessary delays. Part of our underscored belief is that time is something that can be managed, that we actually have some control over time. We believe it's critical or really important to finish things on time, to arrive to appointments on time. If someone's expecting you at a certain time, we believe, very strongly that we must be there at that time. We also highly value people who can multitask, because we're able to get things done quicker and on time when we can multitask. And we tend to focus on the task at hand. Right? When we start a meeting, we have an agenda, we've got 10 minutes, we're going to do this, 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 and this. And we don't want to get sidetracked too much, because we have to get through what we have to get through. And I think one of the underlying values is that belief, again, not only that time can be managed, that we have some control over it, but that it's limited. And that it is valuable because it's limited. And when someone from another culture looks at ours, that's maybe what they see. So when we look at the Indonesian culture, the Indonesian cultural belief about time is kind of the opposite of ours. They don't believe that time is something that we can manage. Time is a natural thing. It's part of nature. It's not something to be managed by us, right? Things will happen when the time is right. And we want to focus on building relationships and not so much worry about getting the task done, but building those relationships, because we know if we get the relationships built, the task will get done. And we also believe that there is time for everything. And if it doesn't get done today, guess what? Tomorrow's 24 new hours, and we can do it again tomorrow. So when you are in the American culture and you look over toward the other side, what you see in the behavior is arriving late, maybe not following up with deadlines. And the interpretation can be that they're lazy, they have a lack of common sense, that they're disorganized. Whereas if you're in the Indonesian culture and you're looking at us, looking at the clock and becoming impatient, you might think that we're impersonal. You might think that we are very impatient people, kind of self-centered, I suppose. So I like that slide because it just reminds me that what we view as a cultural value may be viewed by others as a cultural deficit. And what we view as, I'm sorry, my computer's dying, so I had to switch out my cord. What we view as a cultural deficit to others may be a value. Yes, many, Michelle wrote down that Costa Ricans are very much that way. Many of the Latin American countries are that way. Many of the African countries are that way. And a number of Asian countries are that way. I was fortunate last summer to spend the summer in Malaysia. It was amazing. I learned how to scuba dive. It was a really great vacation, but very strong, different idea of time and time deadlines than what we have. And it was really nice to spend some months stepped out of that and be able to, adjust and have a different cultural lens. Unfortunately, I came back a week before school started, so I had to jump right back into, I only have, so many hours a day, and I have a lot of stuff that needs to get done, and those making lists and checking it off and getting all that stress again. So it's kind of nice sometimes to step out of it too. Oops, sorry. All right. So what we're going to do right now is we are going to have you make a list, just a quick list of 3 or more cultural groups you might identify with. And remember, culture can be an international culture, like a nationality. For example, I might identify with the United States American culture, but culture can also be a role. For example, I'm a teacher, so I'm part of the educational culture. I'm part of the teaching culture. I'm a mom, right? So I'm part of that culture as well. So think about some of the cultural groups that you might belong with. You don't have to write them in the chat or anything, just write them on a piece of paper. I'm going to give you a minute to do that because we're going to come back and use these a little bit later. Does anybody want to share any of theirs?
I wrote down church or Christian church community
Mm-hmm.
because it shares a lot of cultural features as do a lot of countries.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote down Afghans resettlement here in Rochester area. And I also interact with folks who do plants because we have acreage and we do a lot of plants inside and outside, and travel groups that I do.
Great. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions about the iceberg? Okay, because this is what we're going to do with our cultural groups. You're going to pick one of your cultural groups, and you're going to draw an iceberg for your group. And you don't need to spend hours on it, 10 minutes is fine. Just think of as many things as you can, or even just get it started. And then during the next week, when you walk by, every now and then add something new to the list. But what we're going to do is we're going to bring it with us to the conference. And when we get to the conference, we're going to hang them up and we're going to walk around and look at them and compare what our cultural icebergs look like. All right. Everybody excited about that? I'm very excited. I want to see the cultural icebergs, what they look like.
Before we carry on, I want to also introduce our AFS staff hosts, Martha Friend and Robin Weber. I want to give a shout out to for thank both of them for organizing this foundation's course for all of us. This webinar specifically, as well as all of the logistics that we will be having in Texas. So thank you very much to Martha and Robin for getting us all together and moving this forward. So really would appreciate it, and the logistics for today.
Yes, and Martha is our slide advancer.
Master.
So yes, thanks also to that, Martha, for bring up to the task. You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Try and be on time. Did you want to talk about the pre-training assignment at this
Yes,
point? Yeah.
we're going to bring that in just now. Yeah.
Okay.
So when you had received the email, we had asked you to think about an intercultural encounter. It could be a good thing, bad thing, positive, negative, some experience where you were experiencing difference, that you were either firsthand experienced or that you witnessed. And we're going to use that experience in the upcoming breakout groups, which will be fun because you'll have an opportunity to meet folks and share that experience. We're going to be breaking out in groups of 2, and you can share that experience with the person, and then we're going to be working through a particular framework for that analysis. So I'll give you a minute just to kind of catch your breath, get back into the groove of the webinar, and try to remember what you were going to bring to the event, or think of something to discuss. It's an intercultural encounter that you've been a part of or witnessed, where there was some difference and there was maybe some awkwardness, some misunderstanding, or some just general feeling of being uncomfortable. All right, now that you have that in your mind, we're going to jump to actually one of my favorite frameworks. And when we were going through the slides and dividing up who's going to do what, I was like, oh, I'll do the triangle. I love the triangle. And everybody loves triangles, right? All consultants use triangles and whatnot. This triangle, the culture, person, situation model, is my favorite. And the reason being is that we're operating an intercultural world here at AFS. We expect differences based on culture. And when we have an uncomfortable situation or even a positive situation, we're like, oh, it's because the cultures are so similar. You know, hosting a German kid is easy because, you know, German culture is so similar to American culture. Or, oh, hosting a Pakistani is going to be challenging because the culture is so different. You know, it's not always culture. And this is what's so extraordinary, because a lot of times when we're supporting students or families, we all jump to the conclusion that, oh, it's because the culture is different. It's actually maybe not. And that's why I was so excited about this particular triangle. When I had gone through foundations 2 years ago, we were hosting our daughter from Pakistan. We call her our daughter. And we had lots of different situations where there was, like, she didn't understand our behavior and we didn't understand hers. And we eventually were thinking, oh, it's because she's Pakistani and we're American. No, actually, it was because the situation itself was unique or different. She just arrived into a stranger's home. So of course her behavior is because of the situation. It's not because necessarily she's Pakistani. And also her personality might be affecting her behavior. She was very, very talkative. And so am I going to jump to the conclusion that our Pakistani daughter or all Pakistanis are talkative? No, it just, Maria was her name. She happens to be very talkative. So this triangle is really extremely helpful when you're experiencing, frankly, something uncomfortable or something different and what you're witnessing. So we can all witness behavior. We can all witness something happening, what someone says, what someone is doing. That's just what we witness. But again, this goes back to the iceberg. What's behind it? Is it because of the culture differences, or is it because of the situation, or because of the person? So
I was going to say, Jeannie, this is a great model too. It's one of my favorites. And we have a lot of experience. I mean, we all have a lot of experience with this because we all know our behavior. We have our same culture. My culture is my culture today as it was yesterday, and it will be tomorrow, right? But if I'm at work, my behavior will be very different than if I'm with my friends. If I'm in a situation that I feel I'm in danger, my behavior is going to be very different than a situation where I feel uncomfortable. But I'm still the same person and I still have the same culture. And I think that's really easy for all of us to relate to, because we can all think of our different hats that we wear and the different personas we put on when we're in those different situations. And the other one I always think about, because I already told you my daughter has borderline personality disorder. So I have two daughters, and they're a little over a year apart. They have the same culture. They they could be in the exact same situation. We could be doing something as a family, but their reactions and their behavior will be extremely different. If there's a challenge or an obstacle that they have to overcome, one of my daughters will calmly think of ways to get around it, and the other one will pretty much have a meltdown. So I always think of that too, that personality is also a huge part of it. And that's the kind of thing that we really can't account for unless we really know the people really well and get an idea. So that's kind of what I think Jean's trying to tell you when we're looking at that there's all those parts. And I think it's easy for us all to relate to.
Has anyone seen this framework before? You can just unmute and shout out or pop it in the chat.
It's in the kids training,
Oh,
so
yeah.
yeah, I've seen it.
You have, okay. From the kids training.
Yep.
Yeah, we had just introduced it in our post-arrival orientation for the students, and we spent over an hour on this. They were fascinated by it. And the other exciting thing about this is that it's actually a skill, and it really takes practice in conflict to really figure out what is behind the behavior. Is it a cultural issue? Is it the situation, or is it a person? And frankly, the more situations you're in and the more opportunity you apply this framework to conflict, then you're able to parse out what the different things are. And then you can actually have a direct conversation and work through the various different solutions if you know what the source of the behavior is. And we have different examples that Kathy was using, but I think it's most exciting to actually apply this to your own examples. And so what we're going to be doing now is moving into breakout groups in groups of 2. And I hope we'll have to speak with Martha or rely on Martha and Robin to just divide up an odd number into groups. But in the breakout groups, we're going to connect this framework to your real life experience. And so 2 people in a breakout group, the first person will briefly describe the situation that you experienced or witnessed that you feel resulted from cultural differences, and describe what the main challenge was, who were the people involved, and then describe how the situation was managed. Would you be kind enough to flip to the next slide, please? That's the
breakout rooms. There we go.
There we go. And it might be blacked out because she's, I think, in the middle of putting you in breakout groups, but this slide will be shown to you in your breakout group. So the first person is describing the situation, what's the main challenge, the people involved, how was the situation managed, and overall, was it a positive or a negative experience? And then your partner, the second person, will analyze the situation by applying the culture person situation model. So what factors do you think actually influence the behavior of the persons involved in the situation? And really try to parse it out. And I'll give you a clue. Sometimes it's a little bit of everything, but it's really important to distinguish what part is what. And then go ahead and switch. Your partner will share their story, and the first person will go ahead and analyze it using the culture person situation. And we've given you about 10 minutes to go through this so that you really have an opportunity to get to know each other, as well as analyze the stories from these, analyze the situations from the different frameworks. Just give you a little bit of practice in that leading to mastery. Great.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back.
Welcome back. Would anyone care to share with the group their situation and their experience in applying this particular model to their experience?
I don't
We
mind.
didn't have enough
sharing.
time, but I think Patty should share hers. No.
Okay, I'll share mine. I'm a support coordinator and we had two girls on program who were placed in the same family from two different countries, of course. And after they arrived at the end, say the beginning of September, they spoke to each other the first week and a half. They were both in the home, but since then they haven't spoken. So I had a meeting with all of them and just had each of them talk about the culture that they come from, like how do you show respect in your culture? How do you build trust in your culture? And what's family life like in your culture? And actually then it was in your particular family, not just your home culture. And it was almost like you could see their eyes open when they heard the other kid talking about what they had come from, because they came from maybe similar larger cultures, but their family cultures were so different. So they are making baby steps now towards getting along better. I got an email today from a liaison who said, yes, one of them reached out to the other and said, how about we just do a fresh start and see if we can do this better. So
Wow.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to say, as a support coordinator myself, that is the benefit of the behavior model. It really is the triangle. And even as liaisons and whatnot, when you're working with the family, saying that there may be a cultural component is huge as well. It doesn't necessarily the personal behavior or the situation or the culture of the behavior is not positive, if it's causing conflict or things, it doesn't mean that that's an excuse and that the behavior should continue, but it is a good place to start and a really good place to go in with a more open mind and a better framework, like being able to do that. So great. I'm so glad you shared that. And that is really what I think the key to the ICL is really all about.
It's giving us those frameworks in those kind of moments to actually pivot to something, to try to create order out of what seems like chaos or conflict. And when you have one of these models and you start to actually apply it, you go, oh, and it helps you think through the situation, and it helps the participants think through the situation as well, and give it a little bit of structure, because in these heated moments, it can be very, very disconcerting for all parties involved. Anybody else like to share?
Max, you want to share the DoorDash situation?
Oh, this already sounds interesting.
Well, it's your situation.
Well, I can introduce it, and then maybe you can talk about kind of our analysis.
Sure.
Okay. Basically, this happened last night. I had ordered DoorDash, and being in the Bay Area, we have just so many different cultures and languages. And as it turns out, I found later on that our delivery driver spoke Azerbaijani, but did not speak English. And when he arrived with our 2 bags from the restaurant, he insisted that my husband check in the bags and make sure that the order was okay, which my husband did. And I overheard what was happening at the door, and I called over, there should be 4 items. And so he peeked in both bags and, counted the items, and everything looked okay. And he told the driver, if there is an issue, we'll just contact DoorDash, and they can always refund us if anything's missing or not okay. And apparently the driver didn't understand what my husband said about, it being an easy fix if there was one necessary. So he drove off, and as we were taking things out of the bags, we realized that the sauces had been packed separately, so they looked like a separate item, looked like a separate entree. And so there actually was a missing entree. So I sent a text message to the driver saying that, oh, as it happens, there is a missing item. And I got an automatic notification that said the comments are being translated to and from Azerbaijani. And at this point, I was a little frustrated because he didn't understand what my husband had told him. And I very quickly got a hold of DoorDash, and probably less than 2 minutes, they had refunded, given me a credit for the missing item. And it was no big deal because we had the rest of the food. And so I got a response back from the driver saying, "Why are you making my work so difficult?" And I said, "Well, my husband tried to explain to you that it's no big deal. If there's a problem, we can contact DoorDash directly. And in fact, they have refunded our money for that item." And then because I was still a little angry, I remarked that my husband and I only speak English, German, Japanese, French, Italian, Latin, ASL, and neither of us speaks Azerbaijani. And when he found out that DoorDash had already fixed the problem, it was like, oh, okay. So he wrote back, "Oh, thanks," and like a smiley face. And then I felt really bad because, here I am, an AFS volunteer, and I'm basically reaming this guy for not being multilingual. So
hangry.
I was hangry. And that was kind of a personality thing and situational.
And when that stress happens, it's hard to be at your best. We're not always our best people,
Right. But if I had known from the get-go that this guy only spoke Azerbaijani, hey, get out the Google Translator, or, use gestures or what have you. Because yes, I do know some sign language, but if I'm trying to communicate with a deaf person, I don't necessarily know all of the vocabulary. So, then you get into charades or whatever, and it's fine. And the same thing would have happened if I had known that I was dealing primarily with the language barrier versus incompetence. So anyway, that's my story. Started out negative and ended up positive, I would say, because I sent him a compliment back after he texted the smiley and the thanks.
Well, Michelle and Max, thanks so much for sharing that. And you can see right in there that there's a lot, not just culture, right? There was the situation. You're hangry, he's stressed, he's trying to make money, and personality, maybe he's like easygoing, not easygoing, and then there's misinterpretations through text. So yeah, when you break a situation down like that one, which is quite a story, you can see those different elements of that. And that's exactly the beauty of this model. It's like when you're in those moments, you're like, whoa, is this a person, culture, or a situation? And then you can go from there. So thanks so much to everyone sharing. I hope you found that time in the breakout groups, not only an opportunity to apply the model, but just to get to know one another before we see each other in person.
I just wanted to point out real quick. When we think about person, we often think about personality, but I think when we think about person, I think Michelle's story is a great illustration. We also have to look at that person's skill set, right? And so I think with this, when we're looking at his level of English, that is definitely in that person. It's not his personality, but it's definitely the person level, right? The skill set that that person has. And Michelle, I also have lost my patience with people in the past when I've felt they were being incompetent. And then, you know, it sounds like you're a nice person. Usually I'm the one who I can, like, I will dwell on that 10 years later. I'll still remember that time I said this to that person. So my husband always tells me it's because I don't do it very often. If I did it all the time, I wouldn't even notice. So
Yeah, I felt the same way. And, you know, gee, I'm setting a great example. And thankfully, I didn't have my AFS shirt on or anything.
exactly.
But yeah, I was kind of beating myself up over it until we had the resolution at the end.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right, so let's move on then. This is a really good connection because we were just talking about how situations have multiple facets. But let's take a second and look at stereotypes. And in the chat, if you would please
Upside down.
write 3 or 4 things that you know about stereotypes, that would be really helpful because that will help get our discussion started. The more ideas we have, the better our discussion will be. I was going to get you started, and oh my goodness, Patty, you wrote the exact same thing I wrote.
Verbatim.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
We've got some things in here. They aren't true. Everyone tends to stereotype other cultures, tend to be negative, harmful. It can be a generalization, usually based on real experiences, but don't apply to everyone or every situation. Simplistic. Oh, can even overcomplicate
this.
communication.
Yeah. There are a couple who said there are generalizations about a group. There are generalizations, Sandra. Generalizations.
Yeah, we'll get to that point.
Yeah, tend to perceive preconceived notions about a group of people and are often culturally based. Great. Yeah, I think everybody here has an idea of what stereotypes are. If I asked you to make a list of stereotypes, I'm sure you could come up with some pretty quickly. Looking at our comments, I think we're going to have a great discussion about stereotypes. So let's start off with a couple of big ideas. First of all, stereotypes are widely accepted, but not necessarily accurate, right? So some people said they're not true. Judgment or bias about a group. They happen when we assume that all individuals from a particular cultural group have the same characteristics. Now, before we move on to the next point, think about that. Look at that cultural triangle. Do all people from the cultural group have the same characteristics? And do they act the same way in all situations? Exactly. So that is one of the problems with a stereotype, is that it assumes that all people will have that behavior. All right. Another thing about stereotypes is that they're not always wrong or negative. However, they are incomplete, inflexible, and an oversimplified description of people. So sometimes people think that stereotypes are not bad if it's not a bad thing. I was with a coworker just recently who said something about a good stereotype, and I had to stop and say, wait, there aren't good stereotypes, because the very nature of a stereotype is that it's inflexible and it is an oversimplified explanation. And the example I used at that time, again, as a teacher for many years, if I have a student who is Asian, what would be a stereotype that people might assume about my Asian student and their math skills?
Great math skills.
They're really good at math. So if I have an Asian student who's not good at math, and I believe that all Asians are good at math, then I'm going to assume that she's being lazy or she's not working hard enough or something else. And I'm not going to investigate some other causes and find out that maybe she is dyslexic or maybe she has a learning disability. And that can be really harmful for her and her education. So even though the idea that Asians are really good at math doesn't seem like a negative stereotype, by assuming that all people will fit into that category, it can be really negative and harmful too. All right. And the third thing about stereotypes is that they often overshadow all of the other features of a person, and they don't allow us to see or appreciate the other characteristics they have. Right. And I find this is really common as well when someone, and I teach English as a second language, so I hear this a lot. Well, the bilingual students, this, and this, and it's all the same, right? It doesn't distinguish one from the other, and their individual abilities and characteristics are overshadowed by that label that gets put on them, and they become just a number of a certain expectation. And then finally, stereotypes are inflexible and they do not change in the face of new information or experience. So even when the message seems like it might be positive, because it's inflexible, because it's not changing even when confronted with different facts, because it's not allowing us to appreciate the complexity of the person, it pretty much makes it negative. And the other thing, it's not on this slide, but the real key about stereotypes is it does not allow for curiosity. I don't need to ask Michelle any questions because I already know everything I need to know about Michelle. Right? I already know about Precious. She's a brand new liaison. I don't even have to ask her any questions because I already know in my mind exactly what she's going to be like. And that's the problem with stereotypes. It discourages open and frank conversation instead of encouraging it. So you guys are actually now going to get into small groups again with different people this time. You're going to have 4 people. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we do that, we're going to discuss this in your group, but take a second on a piece of paper. We already wrote down those 3 cultural groups you belong to. You remember those? So go ahead and list a few stereotypes that people have about one of those. List a few stereotypes that people have about one of those. How you doing, Midge? All right, Martha. So when we get into our groups now, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing 2 parts. The first part is we're going to talk about the stereotypes that you wrote down. And the real question is, we're going to talk about the stereotypes you wrote down. And I don't know why I have 2 number 1s. I'm sorry about that. And how they make you feel as a member of the group. When you hear those stereotypes, how do you feel? And how do you think that people in these groups are impacted by a stereotype like that? It's just going to take a second. When you're done with that, Martha, if you would show them real quick the second set of questions, and then we'll take it off again. When you're done with that, we're going to get a second set of questions, and we're going to pick one of those stereotypes and talk about how it can be hurtful, even if it's a positive stereotype, like the Asians who are good at math. We're going to talk about the triangle, what else could be influencing that person's behavior. And then we're going to try to get that curiosity. What other things do you notice about that person's cultural group that is above and beyond just the stereotype? So we're going to get into groups of 3 or 4, and we're going to work on those 2 steps. Anybody have anything they want to share about let's start with we'll just go through them in order. Like, how stereotypes make you feel when you've been stereotyped? How do you feel? Just unmute yourself and share.
Irritated.
Mm-hmm.
I would
Good one.
say, I'm sorry.
That's a good answer.
I would say sad and frustrated.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Sometimes confused.
But I think it gives me the opportunity, though, to educate. At least somebody is open to say something, so maybe they're open to receive something.
Hope springs eternal.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think frustration, I always think of your expectation and your reality, and that gap between them is frustration. Mm-hmm. So, you know, your expectation of how you're going to be treated or how people are going to act with you, and then that reality of that stereotype, there is a gap there, and that does cause that frustration, which leads to anger, which I love the fact that Precious is able to take a step back and say, this is a teachable moment. It's wonderful. How do you think people in the groups are impacted by these stereotypes?
They're shortchanged. As you mentioned before, because it's too inflexible, they're not fully seen.
I love that. Yeah, not being seen. They don't feel seen.
They have not to waste a lot of energy going over the same stupid, incorrect details instead of moving forward with whatever they have to contribute.
Right. Unvalued, frustrated again with that having to go back and go over this again. Mm-hmm. All right. So thinking then about some of those specific stereotypes that you shared in your group, was the stereotype hurtful? And the answer everybody knows is yes. Even when it sounds like it's a positive attribute, it can be hurtful, right? Because it, as we said, it just doesn't let the person be seen as an individual. What are some other things that could be influencing people's behavior in those stereotypes?
Just their own personality.
Sure.
I mentioned with some of my completely blind students, they were very capable and well educated, but oftentimes the ones who have total blindness are not getting proper sleep at night because their brains are not receiving that sunlight or the light activation, and so it throws their circadian rhythms off. And if that's not being actively treated, oftentimes in the morning especially, maybe they've only had 2 or 3 hours of sleep, so people would tend to attribute any challenges with schoolwork or anything else for that matter to the blindness versus the situational and health aspects of the blindness.
I'm glad you brought that up, Michelle, because that's really important in our work with AFS as well, right? We're dealing with teenagers. Teenagers are hormonal melting pots. There are a lot of things going on that make it difficult for them to maintain balance sometimes and emotional regulation. Also, they're far from home and they're far from their support. So again, that makes it difficult to maintain some emotional regulation. And they are challenged daily. I know when I travel and I'm surrounded by languages. I am bilingual and I teach classes in Spanish, but when I go down to Chile to visit my family and things, I get a little overwhelmed and I'm exhausted at the end of the day because my brain is in a little bit of overload. And for our students, that's a major thing that's going on as well. And just think about the ones who, when they first hear the first month, trying to adjust over the jet lag and the new schedule and then school. And we all know as teenagers, there's so many demands on the kids now. They do so much homework and they have so many things after school that the amount of sleep they get, it's really limited. I mean, my own children were the same. My students are the same. They barely get 6 to 7 hours of sleep per night. And there's a lot of research that says they need 8 to 9 at their age and their developmental stages. So there's a lot of that. So I'm really glad you brought that up because that is a big thing that we don't always think about when we're looking at them. But yeah, for sure. And it goes right back to that triangle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And back to being hangry or just hungry. Sometimes that impacting our behavior, as we can all attest to.
And then this last question, and again, I'm not sure why they're all number ones, but this last question, what other behaviors can you notice from this group, of this cultural group? And this is huge because when you look at this one, when was it Shan who said you feel unseen and you feel invisible, right? If you only focus on this one behavior, it makes people feel invisible and unseen. What other behaviors can you notice that would maybe make people be more visible and more seen? And you are not just one of the stereotypes I got often was just a dumb blonde. I'm much more than a dumb blonde. I'm not a dumb blonde. I'm a blonde and I have ADD, but I'm not a dumb blonde, right? And when I was a junior in high school, there was a boy who came into my classroom. It was in calculus and as a junior. And this boy came into the room and he was like looking at his schedule and he goes, "Oh, I think I'm in the wrong room." And I was like, "No, this is I mean, you are, unless you want to be in calculus." And he was like, "But why are you here?" Right? Because I'm a dumb blonde. I was a cheerleader and there's just no reason I should have been in calculus as a junior in high school, according to my male counterpart, which is probably why there aren't so many women in as actuaries these days, right? But what other behaviors could you notice from that group that's not going to limit them to where they are at that point? Did anybody have some good ideas they wanted to share from that one? All right, well, let's go to the next slide then, because this is where we talk about how we can actually avoid stereotypes. And it's a simple answer. The answer is suspend judgment, right? And what suspending judgment means is staying flexible and not jumping to the stereotypes. We know what stereotype is: a preconceived idea. It's a prejudice, prejudging somebody. So suspending that judgment is the key to avoiding stereotypes. It means we have to be aware of our own biases, like that boy who came into my calculus class. We need to question our assumptions before we evaluate or judge other people. And this is where Michelle, right, had she been thinking and been able to do it at that moment, to question her assumptions before she got frustrated and judged that Uber Eats driver. That's where we need to do this before. And the important part of this is it allows us to approach people with a certain degree of humility and a sense of curiosity. Precious is a person that I want to get to know. I don't have any preconceived judgment about her based on her role, based on her cultural groups, based on her, until I get to know her. And we might have certain general information about a group as whole, but we should always check to see if that information is accurate and if it applies to the individuals we're meeting. So what I was going to say for this one is we're going to talk about generalizations in a minute, but a number of you guys in the chat, when we talked about what is a stereotype, a number of you said they are generalizations. And to some extent, they kind of are, but they're over-applied generalizations. Like, when a little child runs up to anybody's pant legs and they assume that's their parents, and they're over-generalizing that. That's kind of what a stereotype does, is it overgeneralizes and it just assumes that it applies to everyone without checking its accuracy. And so the key to approaching, or the key to avoiding stereotypes, is to approach people you meet with curiosity and to be aware of those ideas that you might have, that you think you know about them, and just remember that those ideas that you might have, that you have, are probably incorrect. And so it's a good option, a good opportunity to engage in discussion, like Precious said, to educate them. It's a good time to say, hey, I'm confused because here I am in this class, and my understanding from cheerleaders is that there's not really bright at math. So what's going on? Rather than just assuming that you know already. Because as you say, that's just hurtful and frustrating when someone thinks they know all about you and they're way off base. So I'm going to pass this over to Jean to give you some more information about generalizations.
Great, thank you, Kathy. It was fascinating how a lot of, I think we had it 2 or 3 times in the ideas about stereotypes, that they are generalizations. And the main difference between a stereotype and a generalization is that a stereotype assumes it's the same for all people and it's inflexible, as we just had discussed. A generalization is not a stereotype, and it categorizes groups of people with similar characteristics. Not every single person in that group is going to be identical. They're not going to be the same, but they are similar. And for example, people from country X, shall we say Indonesia, I hosted an Indonesian and we looked at the Indonesian iceberg. People from Indonesia tend to, doesn't mean all of them, and it doesn't mean they're all identically the same, but they tend to have an indirect style of communication. So a statement like that is actually a generalization, and it does help us to prepare for an effective and appropriate first encounter with people from another cultural group. And we say first encounter because, you know, not all generalizations are going to be applicable to everybody, but it helps us prepare. And many of us have seen this, for example, in the AFS country guides. These are gold. These are the keys. These are the map that we use as volunteers, as host families, as liaisons, as support coordinators, and as interviewers, to really have generalizations, to have an idea about what to expect when you go to a new place or you're going to be hosting a student from a different country. So in the slides, there's actually is a hyperlink. And when we send you the copies, we want to make sure that you first know they exist, and B, really use those to help inform yourself, because that does help prepare you for welcoming someone into your home. For example, when we welcomed our daughter from Indonesia, we were reading about the generalizations. The main difference, though, is they're flexible, and we realize they don't apply to each and every Indonesian student. And it just, we know that it's going to be challenged and confirmed with more information that we have. It's similar to the danger of a single story. There's a wonderful TED Talk, and we'll have to send you along the link for this, but there's a wonderful TED Talk about the danger of a single story. So if you really only know one thing about, say, Nigeria, because you read it in the newspaper, it doesn't mean that everything in Nigeria is about that. But if you meet a Nigerian, or you work with a Nigerian, or you read a Nigerian author, or you listen to Nigerian music, you're going to have more and different information that then changes your generalization. And that's the difference, the main difference between a generalization and a stereotype, is that a generalization is helpful and it is flexible. Let's go on.
That's a place to start.
It's a good place to start, and it probably will change. So a quick summary of generalizations versus stereotypes. This image is used to demonstrate that generalizations can change about a group, and stereotypes, it's fixed. In generalizations, they're open to new information, whereas a stereotype, it's resistant to new information. I don't care whether that happens to be an Indonesian who's very direct. No, no, no. All Indonesians are just direct. So a stereotype in a bad way would be resistant to the new information. And as Kathy was saying, generalizations will help you lead to increased curiosity and awareness, where a stereotype, there is no curiosity. Everyone's like that. And generalizations allow for individual differences, and stereotypes doesn't allow for individual differences. So this graphic really is another good takeaway as far as a framework when you start thinking about, oh, I feel like I'm saying this about the group. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Don't think about if it's good or bad. Think about whether it's a generalization or a stereotype. And a generalization, sure, can grow with more and new information, and it can be helpful as we welcome students from around the world and as we send our students to other places around the world. Generalizations can actually be very helpful.
This ties to our behavior triangle perfectly. That generalization gives us a cultural note, that place to start, and an idea of what different cultures' values can be. But we also take into account that people react differently in different situations when they're hangry, for example. And we also take into account that each individual person, their personality changes. Or not their personality changes, their personality influences the way they behave. And if it's my daughter, yes, her personality changes, but just kidding. So I like that. That way it ties back down. The generalizations, they fit in that little circle, whereas stereotypes pretty much negate that whole triangle for us. So this is our last few minutes, and I wanted to take some time real quickly to think about what we've learned. We've looked at a couple of things. We talked about the AFS impact. We've talked about the behavior triangle, basic understanding of culture and using the iceberg model, and then stereotypes and generalizations. So the question for you guys, you can pick one of them, all of them as you wish, and talk about why do you think this is important? For example, why is the behavior triangle important? Or why is it important to understand how we all have impact in AFS? Why are these ideas important?
And you're welcome to put some answers in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and speak up.
However you would like.
Or a different way to ask it, have you used some of these frameworks? Again, there's so much experience in the group.
Well,
Many of you have encountered these before.
I would say the information we covered is important as we are trying to support kids and families to have successful experiences. The cultural, situational, all of the components of the experience are going to play an impact on what is, positive and negative in the year. And it's not just the kids who need to be supported and, help and needing guidance, etc. It is also sometimes our families and the families that think and look and act like us that need the support as well. So we have to be able to look at the big picture. And also, professionally, I'm a social worker. So one of the things we learn a lot in this, my career, and many of you are teachers and stuff too, is you have to kind of assess where you're at and where you're coming from and how equipped you are in the moment and in the situation to provide the right type of support and guidance. And so, doing some self-assessment and exploring this a little bit further as it applies to ourselves is really important.
And I like that you said that, Nicola. I was going to say, your ideas were perfect, like totally on when you said it can support the students and the families. And then based on your final comments, I'm going to add that it can also help us when we're working with fellow volunteers and other people in AFS as well. Because sometimes they need
our lives.
Exactly.
Other aspects of our lives, in our own families, in our communities. These skills are quite transferable. We also
Um,
have here and broadens your mind to understand culture and different backgrounds. And I think the behavior triangle would be helpful in working with families and students when they're having conflicts.
Exactly. And to give us a place to start, right? And that shared language. So if we look back at the AFS ICL goals, we have a shared language and we have a place to start when we're looking and evaluating what's going on around us. So here's my last question for you guys, and this I think is the most important one. This information today, how are we going to use it? Like, so now we know what we learned, we know why it's important. So everybody think of a way you're going to use the information we learned today in between now and when we meet up again, maybe in Texas. Can you find a way that you might be able to use this? Shan's like, oh, definitely.
That's great.
So Shan, what are you thinking? How are you going to use this?
Our team just came off our post-arrival orientation, and we had a weekend with the kids, and a few resetting of expectations, and but both on the parent side, on the kids side, and so I had already been messaging with some liaisons, and we had been talking how much of this is cultural differences, how much of it is just family dynamic differences. So I'll be working a lot of this week.
Right. And you said you were in support.
Yeah.
Like me. Yeah. All of this is just right out of the support playbook. Somebody Precious has a home visit, our new liaison. So just in time, right? So yes, definitely can use it with your student. Nice. And I added that bottom part because I find that this is really important with members of other cultural groups like teenagers in general and spouses. I use a lot of this with my spouse. I take a step back and go, okay, what else could be contributing to this? What else is going on, right? And it's so important to remind myself not to make assumptions that are inflexible. We've been married 38 years, and it gets to be pretty easy to start making some inflexible assumptions, right? So I use this a lot to remind myself about that as well.
These skills are transferable. Yes.
For sure. It's part of our superpowers.
Exactly.
Yeah, if I go in to meet with a family where I think what the kid is doing, it clearly comes from their culture in my assessment. And often if I say that to the family, well, it could just be cultural difference. They're like, oh yeah, right. But if I can go in with the triangle and say behavior comes from different places, and let's look at it and see if we can figure out where this behavior is coming from, maybe they'll be a little more open.
I think so. And Patty, I've had that response as well. When I say, well, it could be a cultural component.
Just take it out of the fridge or take it out of the oven, please.
I sometimes get the response that, they get angry that I'm saying it's not an issue. Because I say it could have some cultural components doesn't mean it's not an issue. As I said earlier, it's still an issue, but it gives us a place to start to look at it, and it gives us ideas of how we can support it. So like if it comes back to that timeliness, the idea of time and not time, it gives us some strategies, and it allows us to recognize the strengths of that other person's point of view, and saying those are great strengths in certain situations. However, in our culture, this is where the strength, what we need to do, and we can start making those changes. So I love that. That's definitely true. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for sharing. Next steps, our in-person workshop in Texas.
There we go. Yes. So we've got more topics ahead of us. We will be reviewing what we've done today, just to refresh our memories and share it with others that weren't able to join us online. And we'll be exploring other topics, including cultural value dimensions. So not just the iceberg itself, but how are those chopped up, shall we say. We'll also be taking a look at communication styles, which do vary culturally and by the situation and by the person. So we'll be taking a look at that. And suspending judgment, we'll be spending more time on that. There's a very specific model. Many of you might already have been familiar with it, the DIVE model. it's a way to break it down into different distinct steps. And then we'll be looking at understanding inequality and how that affects our work here at AFS and being global citizens and being able to be the change that we want to be and that AFS is supporting each and every one of us to do. So we look forward to seeing you in Texas, and we are available via email if you have any questions between now and November 1st. And we'll be sending out these slides for you with the links, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And
Yes. And we cannot wait to see you. We're so excited. There's many reasons why we're excited. One, I get to get out of Chicago and go down to Texas, which is going to be exciting. Two, I get to spend the Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, with you guys. It's about the second most exciting. A couple of years ago, I went and did that in Mexico City, so I'm going to have to keep that at the top of my list. But spending it with you guys will be great. And please remember to draw your own iceberg. We are going to just put them up. You don't even have to put your name on it. That's fine. We're just going to put them up and get an idea of different people's cultural icebergs. And that way we can compare and contrast them. If we only have one or two, it's going to be difficult to do. So please take the time to do that. We would really appreciate it.
it's great to meet you all, and we look forward to seeing you in Texas.
Truly been a pleasure. So thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
you all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.